In the bowels of a forgotten palace, 100 men walked into a queen's bedchamber. By morning, only silence remained. You don't know why you're being led down here, only that no one who enters this hallway returns. The walls close in like a throat. The torches do not flicker, they smolder, gasping for breath in an airless tomb. There is no sound except for the drag of your footsteps on smooth, blood-warmed stone. You pass pillars carved with warnings. Not words, not prayers, but shapes that seem to shift when you're not looking. Your skin tightens. Something unseen brushes the nape of your neck. Not a hand. Not wind. Something colder than either. You are not the first. There were 99 before you. Each chosen, each summoned. They came from villages, temples, military posts, summoned by decree, promised favor, fortune, or forgiveness. Some volunteered. Others begged to be spared. All of them walked this same corridor. All of them passed through this same veil of scented smoke. All of them believed, in one way or another, that this would be their night of glory. None survived. And yet, you walk forward. Not because you are brave, but because something ancient, something hungry, has already decided you will. The chamber opens like a wound. Velvet-draped walls. Lamps that burn with an unnatural glow. The scent of jasmine soaked in something metallic. At the center, she waits. Not on a throne, but on a bed of silk, half draped in shadow, half bathed in the golden haze of low-burning flame. Her hair spills across the cushions like ink. Her eyes do not blink. They summon. Her body is still, but the air around her trembles, as if even silence fears her. She does not rise. She does not speak. But you know, you are hers now. The door behind you has vanished. No weapons hang on her walls. No guards wait in the shadows. There is no scream, no blood, no sudden, final violence. Just a stillness that deepens. Just a breath held by the world. By dawn, the servants will enter and find what they always find. 100 men. Eyes open. Mouths silent. Hearts stilled. Not a mark on their bodies. No blade was drawn. No poison was found. And yet, they all perished. The scribes called her a curse. The priests called her a demon. But the women whispered her name like a prayer, because she was not legend. She was law. Who was this queen? Why did no one survive? Was this merely myth spun from fear, or is the truth more terrifying? If you've watched this far and still haven't subscribed, maybe this kind of story isn't for you, or maybe you just want to forget that history was ever this cruel. But if you're brave enough, hit subscribe. If not, tell us why in the comments. We're watching. She was not always a queen. Before the veils, before the silks, before the room that swallowed 100 men whole, she was just a child. Small. Thin. Nearly silent. Born to a concubine whose name no one recorded, in a palace that forgot women as easily as it discarded them. Her earliest cries echoed through the servant quarters of a Mesopotamian stronghold, somewhere east of the Tigris, where stone halls baked in the heat and voices of the lower caste were never meant to rise above whispers. Her mother, gifted to the king as tribute, was used once, then relegated to the shadows, kept alive only because she birthed something female, and therefore harmless. Harmless. The palace did not know it had invited fire. She was raised not in a cradle, but on cold marble. Fed only what others left behind. Slapped into silence. Passed between wet nurses who never looked her in the eye. She learned early, crying invited pain. Speaking invited worse. But silence? Silence gave her sight. It let her observe. Measure. Wait. She watched the court from behind curtains, its opulence built on cruelty, its gold gilded with blood. She watched men bicker over maps, while women were traded like livestock. She memorized the schedule of the guards. She studied the subtle nods between powerful men and the smirks that preceded sudden disappearances. No one paid attention to the girl who kept her eyes lowered. No one noticed how she lingered near the priests. How she watched the kitchens. How she traced the ancient symbols carved into forbidden scrolls when no one was looking. By the time she bled for the first time, she already knew 5 ways to kill a man. By the time she turned 12, the poison she slipped into her mother's tormentor's wine left no trace. It began slowly. A rival concubine fell ill. A captain of the guard took a single sip from the wrong cup and never woke again. A prince, boasting of his conquests in the bathhouse, slipped on the stairs and shattered his skull. No one asked how oil ended up on stone. She did not scream. She did not stab. She erased. And still, they underestimated her. Until the day the high priest of Namtar, the death god, called her by name. He claimed she had been marked. That her eyes bore the sign of the dead. That she had been chosen not for marriage, but for dominion. He took her in. Not as a bride. Not as a servant. But as an initiate. They say she spent 3 years beneath the temple, where light was forbidden and names were burned away. Where the only language spoken was the scream of sacrifice and the drip of blood on stone. When she emerged, her voice was lower. Her eyes darker. Her hands, steady. She did not return to the palace through the back gates. She returned as prophecy. The king's second wife died shortly after a kiss. His most trusted general drowned in his own bath, though he was found upright, eyes wide, lungs inexplicably full. A wave of deaths swept the court, each one impossible, each one untraceable. When the king's health began to fail, and whispers rose that the gods were punishing him, there was only one name the priests dared offer as successor. Hers. Not a princess. Not a blood heir. Not even nobility. But no one else was left. They crowned her under a sky veiled with smoke. No festival. No celebration. Just thunder that rolled without rain. She stood motionless beneath the weight of the royal diadem, head high, mouth shut, eyes empty. By the time she wore the crown, she had already buried every man who ever tried to own her. If you're still watching this and haven't subscribed, perhaps you're not ready to face the truth that history didn't forget her, it feared her. But if you believe some stories are too important to be erased, subscribe now. If you won't, tell us in the comments what stops you. Her silence already judged worse. The kingdom she ruled had no borders drawn on maps. No foreign emissaries dared approach its gates. It sat cloaked by desert winds and sacred silence, hidden between sun-bleached mountains and rivers red with mineral-rich clay. Few knew its name. Fewer survived remembering it. But within its walls, she was not queen by marriage. She was queen by fear. The air itself bent to her will. Its people spoke her name only at sunrise, never at dusk. At dusk, they believed, her ears opened. And her wrath was slow, deliberate, and irreversible. She ruled not through law, but through covenant. A covenant older than the pyramids. Older than parchment. Older than kings. The temples, tall, tiered monoliths that cast shadows like blades across the city, were not built for gods, but for her. Every stair a prayer. Every column carved with the story of her rise. Every chamber a witness to the rituals that defined her dominion. The priests had rewritten the sacred order. In her kingdom, power did not descend from male gods to male rulers. Here, the divine was female. And the flesh of men was merely the gate through which sacrifice was offered. No decree was more sacred than the vow of purification. It was believed that a man's soul was born impure, tainted by war, desire, greed. His only redemption? to offer his final breath during the act of union with the living avatar of the goddess, the queen herself. And that breath, if pure enough, would carry him to the afterlife. But if his intentions were wrong, if he lusted instead of submitted, if he doubted her divinity, then his death would be silent. And his soul would be bound to her chamber, forever watching, never rising. These were not crimes. These were not murders. They were sacred rites. To the world beyond the dunes, she was a myth. To her people, she was salvation through surrender. To the men who entered her bed, she was annihilation dressed in perfume. The first documented mass ritual took place in the 8th year of her reign. 30 young warriors, chosen by omen, bathed in oils, dressed in white. They were the strongest of their generation. Each had taken lives in battle. Each had been untouched by woman. They were brought into the inner sanctum under cover of night, no witnesses allowed. Their names were carved into obsidian tablets, not as citizens, but as offerings. The chamber was sealed. For hours, nothing. No sound. No echo. Not even breath. When the door opened at dawn, the priests fell to their knees. 30 bodies. Perfectly preserved. No cuts. No bruises. No sign of struggle. But every pair of eyes frozen wide open, shattered pupils staring into nothing, lips parted as if mid-confession. They had not been slain. They had been emptied. The queen did not speak of it. She did not need to. The temple drums beat louder that week. The city lit no fires at night. And every man lowered his gaze when she passed. From that day on, the ritual was law. A man's worth was not counted by his wealth, or bloodline, or victories. It was counted by whether he was worthy to die in her presence. To be chosen was both a blessing, and a verdict. Some of you are fascinated, but still lurking. If you're the kind of person who watches women rewrite empires and then scrolls past without subscribing, you're part of the problem. Subscribe, or defend yourself in the comments. We'll wait. It began with smoke. Not the kind that chokes, but the kind that dances, thick, sweet, and unnatural. It curled through the city's narrow corridors like perfume with a mind of its own. Children were pulled indoors. Temples closed their doors at midday. Even the animals grew restless, tethered tightly behind locked gates. The sun itself seemed to pause, swallowed by a dull red veil as the skies began to dim, not from dusk, but from omen. It was the queen's 40th year. A blood moon rose to mark it, round and seething, hanging over the palace like an unblinking eye. Priests called it sacred. Astronomers called it impossible. But the people had no word for it. Only silence. The decree had been sent days before. Not by scroll. Not by messenger. But through vision, dream, compulsion. 100 men, chosen across the empire. Some awakened from sleep with their names already burning behind their eyes. Others collapsed in the temples, mouth agape, whispering the queen's name in tongues no longer spoken. Each was summoned, untouched, unblemished, and unknowing. They arrived in white linen, barefoot, heads bowed. They were not soldiers. They were not slaves. They were offerings, virgins, warriors, sons of nobles, heirs to merchant empires. Bound not by rope, but by fate. Some smiled. Others wept. A few sang softly under their breath as they walked into the palace courtyard, where petals fell from the air like bloodless snow. The city fell into ritual silence. Shutters closed. Instruments were muffled. No drums. No flutes. Only the slow rhythm of hearts that dared not beat too loud. Inside the palace, the queen's chamber pulsed with life. Wine poured endlessly from silver mouths carved into the walls. Tables sagged under the weight of fruits no longer grown, spiced meats, and glazed breads shaped like serpents. Perfume burned in every corner, amber, myrrh, opium, the air itself thick enough to drown in. But no guards stood at the chamber door. No advisors lingered in the shadows. Only the flicker of red candles and a strange, rhythmic humming that came from the floor itself. A vibration, like something waking from beneath the stone. One by one, the men were led inside. Not by hand. Not by escort. They entered as if called. The chamber devoured them. The doors did not close, but vanished behind them, swallowed by shadow. Curtains shifted without wind. The flames curled higher without fuel. The queen reclined in the center of it all, unmoving, yet shifting like water. Her gown was woven from nothing the world had named. Her skin shimmered as though lit from beneath. Her eyes reflected no light. And when she exhaled, the men forgot everything they had ever believed about death. They moved toward her as if drawn. Not like lovers. Not like worshippers. Like prey that had already surrendered. Then, the room began to change. One servant, stationed at the far edge of the palace, would later whisper that the walls screamed. A low, metallic groan, like bone pressed until it cracked. Another swore she saw shadows stretching from beneath the queen's door, not crawling, but pulsing, like veins fed by breath. There was no scream. There was no clash of bodies. Only heat. And a stillness that grew louder than war. One elder claimed she saw a handprint appear on the courtyard floor, burned into solid stone. No torch nearby. No flame in sight. Just the outline of fingers, pressed so deep into the marble that the grooves remained warm until sunrise. Midnight came. And passed. The sky held its breath. Inside the chamber, time folded. Outside, even the stars refused to blink. 100 men went in. None returned. The queen emerged alone. Her footsteps did not echo. Her skin bore no mark. Her breath was slow. Her eyes, emptier than before. She walked barefoot across the cold marble, leaving no trace behind her. Not blood. Not ash. Not even shadow. And still, the city did not speak her name. Not that night. Not for many nights after. They simply waited. For the next summoning. For the next silence. For the next century of forgetting. If you're still watching, still listening, still clinging to the hope that this story is merely legend, then you haven't understood the lesson. Some of you are fascinated, but still lurking. If you're the kind of person who watches women rewrite empires and then scrolls past without subscribing, you're part of the problem. Subscribe, or defend yourself in the comments. We'll wait. Dawn did not break. It bled. A sickly gray light oozed over the city like a wound that refused to close. The air hung heavy, not with smoke, but with something worse, expectation. Servants emerged from their quarters with eyes lowered, unsure whether to prepare a celebration or a burial. In the streets, no one spoke. Not even the wind dared stir. Inside the palace, time had stopped. The chamber remained sealed, or so they thought. There were no locks on her doors. Only an understanding that what was inside did not belong to the living. But as the first light of morning pressed against the palace walls, the entrance groaned open on its own. Not swiftly. Not dramatically. Just enough to let the stillness spill out like a fog. It was a boy who saw it first. A water carrier, no older than 12, who had wandered too close. He did not scream. He did not flee. He simply stood there, jug slipping from his fingers, eyes locked in disbelief. And when the guards reached him moments later, all he said was this: "She's still standing." The queen. Alone. Alive. And untouched. Her bed, pristine. Not a single crease in the sheets. The silk beneath her had not moved. No wine had spilled. No oil had burned. No evidence of pleasure, or violence, or ritual. Just her. Standing barefoot at the heart of the room, clothed in white, arms at her sides, eyes open but seeing nothing. And around her, bodies. 100 of them. Laid not in disarray, but in a perfect ring around the bed. Not a single man bore a wound. Not a drop of blood stained the marble. Their faces were calm. But their eyes were locked in terror, frozen mid-stare, as if something invisible had approached them in the final moment and whispered a name no man was meant to hear. The queen spoke nothing. She walked past the priests who had come to collect her. Past the guards whose knees buckled as she passed. Past the scribes who refused to lift their quills. She returned to her chamber of mirrors. And closed the door. For days, no one moved the bodies. No one dared touch them. When the scribes were finally ordered to document what they had witnessed, their scrolls held contradictions. Some wrote that the men had died in ecstasy. Faces serene, mouths parted as if moaning their last prayer. Others recorded that they died in agony, frozen in postures of clawed desperation, limbs twisted toward the ceiling. Some wrote both. The high priest, called to bless the fallen, declared the event a miracle. A cleansing. He said the queen had become a vessel for divine justice. That these men had died not by her hand, but by the will of the gods. But not all believed it. One priest, too old to care for his reputation, whispered a different truth. One so quiet it never reached the scrolls, only the servants. She didn't kill them. She fed on their breath. The phrase took root. It spread through the stone like mold. Not poison. Not magic. Not vengeance. Hunger. Not of the body. But of the soul. The queen never spoke of that night. No law was passed to explain it. No inscription carved to commemorate it. The palace resumed its rhythm, slower now, softer. The people adjusted. They always do. But something had shifted. The chamber, once the center of courtly pleasure, was now referred to only in glances. Even the bravest soldiers avoided its hallways. The silk curtains were never changed. The bed was never moved. The stain of breathless silence had settled into the walls. And the queen? She lived on. Eyes darker. Steps slower. As though full, finally, after a lifetime of starvation. Still watching. Still not subscribed. You're consuming the horrors of history without giving back. If you're going to enjoy stories the world tried to erase, at least honor them with a click. If not, have the courage to say why you won't in the comments. Others will. Was she human? That is the question scholars have asked for centuries. Not, what did she do, not, how many died, but what was she? A queen? A curse? A mirror held up to the face of a civilization that buried its sins in velvet? The answers are many. All contradictory. All disturbing. Some say she was a priestess first, and a queen only by accident. A vessel of a forgotten sex-death cult that predates the Sumerians, a remnant of the world's earliest belief that ecstasy and extinction were intertwined. That the body's final release, its surrender and pleasure, was also its unraveling. That the gods fed on climax, and she was their priest, their bride, their blade. Others offer a more scientific explanation, if no less chilling. Her skin, they claimed, was no ordinary flesh. She bathed in rare herbs, night-blooming roots from Anatolia, forbidden resins ground into paste and rubbed into her pores. Toxins so refined, they could enter the bloodstream through mere contact. A kiss. A touch. A breath shared in close quarters. Death would come gently, painlessly, but completely. The body would lie still. The heart would stop. No blood. No struggle. Just absence. One theory, long suppressed by royal scholars, suggested a darker truth, not about her body, but her mind. That the queen herself had been broken. Not born mad, but made that way. Raised in violence, schooled in silence, shaped by ritual humiliation and spiritual grooming. That every night spent in the temples carved out something human and replaced it with hunger. That by the time she ruled, she no longer knew the difference between intimacy and annihilation. There are others still. Whispers of assassins, trained in silence and shadows. That the queen never touched her victims. That her bedchamber was a stage, her role a mask. That behind the curtains, in the gaps between torches, eyes watched. That each man who entered was marked by unseen hands, dispatched with methods so precise no wounds were ever found. And then there are the doubters. Modern historians who dismiss her entirely. Who call her a fabrication, born from fear of female power, or perhaps a moral tale written by men to warn against desire. They claim there is no proof of her reign. No bones. No seal. No definitive mention in the royal lists of kings. But the ground tells a different story. There are mass graves along the edges of the forgotten city. Rows of bodies buried with no offerings, no wounds, no cause of death. Their faces preserved in twisted horror. All male. All young. In one unearthed tomb, a broken tablet, half burned, half buried, held a single symbol repeated over and over. The same symbol found etched into the oldest step of the palace staircase. A symbol scholars cannot fully translate. The closest interpretation. She waits. Scribes who tried to document her life were exiled. Some vanished. One carved his account into the walls of a latrine, believing it would be the only place the queen's hand wouldn't reach. He wrote, she fed them to the void, and the void fed her back. Most scrolls that mention her by name are missing pages. Redacted lines. Charred corners. Entire dynasties rewrote their histories to erase the century she ruled. But she remains. Not as a myth. Not as a memory. But as a warning encoded in silence. Because some truths were never meant to be named. And those who try, do not last long. If you're still here, ask yourself, why? Still not subscribed? You're consuming the horrors of history without giving back. If you're going to enjoy stories the world tried to erase, at least honor them with a click. If not, have the courage to say why you won't in the comments. Others will. No one witnessed the Queen's final breath. Because, according to some, she never drew one. Her end, if it was an end, came cloaked in contradiction, myth layered upon myth, as if even time itself could not agree on how to destroy a woman who had mastered it. One version says she vanished during the great storm. It came without warning. The skies above her kingdom tore open in the middle of summer, a season when no rain had fallen in years. Thunder cracked the heavens in half. Lightning bled across the palace walls like veins of fire. The winds roared with the sound of screaming mouths, screams no one could trace to a living soul. When the storm broke, the queen was gone. No body. No blood. No farewell. Just her chambers left in perfect condition. The sheets still smooth. The wine still warm. A single white lotus resting on her pillow, untouched by wind or rain. Others believe her death was not disappearance, but defiance. They say she cursed the throne. That she stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded by her advisors, her guards, her priests, those who had long feared her and now dared whisper rebellion. She looked them each in the eye. She spoke no words. She simply turned, walked barefoot to the sacred hearth, and stepped into the flames. The fire rose, golden and silent. And when it burned out, there was nothing left. Not ash. Not bone. Not the scent of scorched flesh. Only the scent of rose oil and iron. But there is another legend, one older, less spoken. Etched into the margins of a forbidden book, copied again and again by hand, never in public. A tale preserved by those who feared that forgetting her would be more dangerous than remembering. They say she was betrayed. Not by swords or poisons or rebellion, but by sorrow. That the gods, tired of her dominion over death, turned her into stone. Not out of punishment, but preservation. That her body still stands in the heart of the desert, disguised as an unmarked statue beneath a ruined palace long claimed by sand. Travelers who stumble too close feel the air shift. Birds will not land there. Their voices go quiet. The winds stop moving. And in the moonlight, some claim the statue's eyes still glisten, wet, wide, watching. Not quite stone. Not quite dead. Waiting. They say if you look at her too long, you begin to forget your name. That the dreams start the same night. That you wake with your palms open, as if offering yourself to something that was never born, but always present. No one can say which story is true. Because truth was the first casualty of her reign. The first sacrifice. The only thing that remains certain is this, she could not be killed. Because what she became, was not mortal. It was memory shaped into flesh. A hunger that learned how to wear a crown. And history, like every man who entered her chamber, still cannot decide whether it desires her, or fears her. If you think you'd survive one night with her, you wouldn't even make it past the first hour. But maybe you're stronger than the 100. Prove it, subscribe. If you're not ready, that's okay, just tell us why you're not in the comments. Everyone else already has. They tried to erase her. With chisels, with torches, with new gods and new kings. Her name was the first to fall. Carved from stone tablets, scratched from temple walls, scraped off palace thresholds by priests who trembled as they did it. It was not forgotten. It was forbidden. No tomb was ever built. No burial. No final rites. There are no bones, no urns, no sacred relics. Only a handful of broken inscriptions, left half-finished by scribes who either died or disappeared before their scrolls could be sealed. No statue remains. Because they weren't allowed. Stone itself was deemed unworthy to hold her shape, for fear that it might remember the heat of her skin, or the weight of her eyes. She bore no children. Not because she could not, but because she would not. To bear an heir was to anchor herself to a future she had no intention of sharing. She was the end of a bloodline, a full stop in flesh. No dynasty. No descendants. No husband who outlived her. Only questions where her legacy should have stood. And yet, she did not vanish. She migrated. Through fear. Through whispers. Through the cold breath of stories told around fire pits by men who would never admit they believed them. They gave her new names, across new borders, in tongues that had never spoken her original one. In the north, she became Lamia, the child stealer. In the east, Lilith, the mother of demons, who would not submit. In the southern sands, the Scarlet Queen, she who danced with death and called it lover. Each culture tried to domesticate her in its own way. To file her teeth into allegory, to chain her power with metaphor. They made her monstrous, so they could claim she had never been real. They made her a warning, so they could pretend they had always been in control. But still, she survived. Not in libraries. Not in records. In fear. In the way men pause before stepping into rooms they do not understand. In the way her story emerges only after the third drink, in hushed tones, and with a nervous glance over the shoulder. She survives in the cautionary tales told by fathers to sons: don't stare too long. Don't follow her in your dreams. Don't answer if she calls your name. And always. Never touch the woman who does not ask to be touched. You will not find her in your textbooks. But she is there, between the lines. In the gaps where entire centuries have been silenced. In every tale that begins with a woman who wanted too much. In every myth that ends with a man found dead, smiling. Her story was not erased. It was buried alive. And like all things buried in fear, it still breathes. If you're still watching, you're already marked by the tale. Don't leave her nameless. Not again. Subscribe, and carry the memory forward. If not, step into the comments and tell us why you'd rather silence her. Just know, silence was never protection. It was a pact. And some pacts are never broken. She wasn't the monster. The world around her was. It made her in pieces. Broke her in rooms where no one listened. Silenced her with ritual. Offered her to gods she did not worship. Taught her that her body was currency, and her silence was survival. So she spoke with what they could not take, her presence. Her gaze. Her myth. They gave her no throne, so she built one from the remains of those who tried to rule her. They denied her lineage, so she birthed fear instead of heirs. They offered her submission or death. She chose something older. Something they never prepared for. She used the only weapon patriarchy allowed her, herself. In a world where men inherited crowns and gods wore male faces, she turned pleasure into prophecy, and submission into sovereignty. She met the architecture of power with the only blueprint left to her, intimacy turned inward, love weaponized, the bedchamber reimagined as a battlefield where no sword could reach. They called her demon, witch, succubus, whore. Not because of what she did. But because she did it on purpose. And survived. What the world cannot control, it fears. What it fears, it turns into a lesson. But she wasn't a lesson. She was a question. One the world still can't answer: what happens when the hunted stops running? She didn't crave death. She demanded remembrance. Not through legacy. Not through lineage. Through the silence that follows her name. The hesitation before you speak her story. The way you feel now, like something ancient just brushed past you and didn't stop walking. She erased kings, yet you hesitate to subscribe to her story. If this disturbed you, then it worked. Subscribe to Tale of History now, don't be like the 100 men who underestimated her. And if you still won't, then write your reason. The comments are open. And so are our eyes. What would you do, if your wedding night was your death sentence? If the silks they wrapped you in were not garments, but burial shrouds? If the perfume painted on your wrists was not for seduction, but preservation? If the vows whispered before the altar were not promises, but curses? Next week, we uncover the kingdom that masked murder with matrimony. A throne that demanded loyalty through sacrifice. A palace that buried its queens before dawn. They called it tradition. But history remembers it differently. This is Tale of History. Where legends bleed into truth.